There is a chapel on the north side of the Longdendale Valley, above the water, at the end of a track that most drivers on the A628 go past without seeing. St James's, Woodhead. It is small and low, built of gritstone gone almost black with a century and a half of weather, and it has not been a working church for a long time. The graveyard around it is the reason to stop. Some of the stones are the ordinary stones of a moorland parish, farmers and their wives and the children who did not get through a winter. Others are not ordinary at all. They belong to men who came here from Ireland, from Lancashire, from wherever there was no work that year, and who died within a few weeks of one another in the summer of 1849. What killed them was cholera. 28 of them, by the count that has come down to us, out of an encampment of huts and turf shelters at the western end of a hole that was being driven under the moor. The disease took men in hours rather than days. A man could be working a face at 7 in the morning and be dead before the light went off the tops. The navvies at Woodhead had paid out of their own wages to keep a surgeon on site, a man called Henry Pomfret, and it was Pomfret who watched most of it, and Pomfret who afterwards put the numbers in front of people with the power to do something about them. There is a field beside the chapel yard with nothing in it. No stones, no markers, nothing but grass and a dry stone wall. Local tradition says it holds the Catholic dead, who could not be laid in consecrated ground of the wrong denomination. Nobody has ever counted them properly, and nobody ever will. This is the Woodhead line, 41.5 miles from Manchester to Sheffield, straight across the spine of the Pennines, through 3 tunnels driven under the same shoulder of moor at 3 different points in history. It cost lives to build in the 1840s. It cost more lives to double in the 1850s. Then, a little over 100 years after the first bore opened, the British state spent £4.25 million on a brand new tunnel beside the old ones, strung the whole route with overhead wire at 1500 volts direct current, and built a fleet of electric locomotives that ran nowhere else on the network. 27 years after those wires were switched on, the last train went through. The route closed completely. The track came up. The newest tunnel in the Pennines, still lined in fresh concrete, was handed to the electricity industry to carry cables. The question worth asking is why a country builds something like that and then walks away from it inside a single working lifetime while the copper is still bright and the ballast is still clean. Start with the geography, because the geography is the whole argument. In the 1830s, Manchester was cotton and Sheffield was steel, 2 of the richest manufacturing towns on earth, sitting roughly 40 miles apart with the Pennines in between. Everything moving between them went by Packhorse Road or by a canal system that had to go the long way round. The obvious answer was a railway, and the obvious problem was that the ground rose to over 1,000 feet and there was no easy way through. The Sheffield, Ashton-under-Lyne and Manchester Railway got its Act of Parliament in 1837. Its engineer, Charles Vignol, had a real reputation and a fatal weakness for taking payment in shares. He estimated the tunnel at a figure the directors liked. Then the money markets turned, the shares collapsed, and he could not meet the calls on them. He resigned in 1838, ruined by his own project, and the work passed to Joseph Locke. Locke put the cost of the tunnel at around £200,000, which, in the money of the day, was an enormous sum for 3 miles of hole. Work began in October 1838. 5 shafts were sunk from the moor top, some of them nearly 600 feet deep, and the men worked outward from the bottom of each one, driving toward each other through millstone grit and shale, by candlelight, with hand drills and black powder. At the peak, something like 1,500 men were on the job. They lived on the moor in huts they built themselves, in a place with no road worth the name, no drainage and no clean water. The work was drilling by hand into rock, packing the hole with powder, lighting it and getting clear. Safety fuses existed. They were slower. The assistant engineer at Woodhead, a man named Wellington Purdon, was asked at a parliamentary inquiry whether the safer fuse should be used, and the words usually quoted from his answer are that it involved such a loss of time and the difference was so small that he would not recommend it for the sake of the extra lives it might save. He said that out loud to a committee and did not seem to think it remarkable. The first Woodhead tunnel was 3 miles and 13 yards long, single track, and when it opened in December of 1845, it was one of the longest railway tunnels in the world. The directors held a celebration with a special train and speeches about the union of the two great manufacturing districts. The cost in men is where the argument starts, and it has never stopped. Depending on which source you take, between 26 and 32 men were killed outright in the 7 years of driving. Somewhere between 140 and 200 were seriously injured, meaning crushed, blinded, or maimed badly enough to end their working lives. Another 450 or so suffered lesser injuries. Every time this line comes up, somebody points out that 26 is the number Pomfret actually gave, and somebody else answers with 32 and can cite a source for it, and they are both, in their way, telling the truth. What nobody disputes is the shape of it. Out of a workforce of that size on one job in 7 years. Pomfret's figures reached Edwin Chadwick, then the most famous sanitary reformer in the country, and a man who understood the power of a comparison. In January of 1846, he told the Manchester Statistical Society that the casualty rate among the Woodhead navvies had been worse than that of a British regiment at Waterloo. It went round the newspapers, which is exactly what it was designed to do. A select committee sat that July and recommended making companies liable for the men who dug their lines. Its report was never debated in the House. One tunnel was not enough. A single bore meant single line working under the moor, with trains held at each portal waiting their turn, and the traffic across the Pennines grew faster than anyone had planned for. So they went back and did it again. A second bore was driven parallel to the first, a few yards to the north, and this is the one the men in the chapel yard were digging when the cholera came through the camp in 1849. By most accounts, the company took rather more care the second time. There were better huts and some attempt at sanitation. It made no difference to the epidemic, which was in the water and moved through a crowded camp in a matter of days. Work stopped. Men ran. Some of them walked off over the moor and did not come back. The tunnel was finished anyway, opening to traffic in 1852. Between the two bores, the engineers left cross passages spaced along the whole 3 miles, and those are the sort of thing you look at twice, because what they really are is a way of getting men out of one tunnel and into the other when something goes wrong. What resulted was one of the hardest pieces of main line in England to work with steam. From Manchester, the climb ran 12 miles up the Longdendale Valley, past Mottram and Hadfield and Crowden, all the way to the tunnel mouth, and trains needed banking engines at both ends. Then 3 miles of single bore, tight to the loading gauge, with a heavy coal train on the climb and no ventilation to speak of. The smoke did not clear. Crews learned to soak their handkerchiefs and tie them over their faces, and firemen learned to lie flat on the footplate boards, where the air was slightly less poisonous, feeling for the shovel by touch. Men were carried out of Woodhead unconscious more times than the record properly kept track of. Drivers who worked it for 30 years described it afterwards in flat, unemotional terms, which is usually how you can tell. What kept the route alive was coal, South Yorkshire pits on the eastern side, Lancashire industry and the Mersey ports on the western side, and a demand for fuel that never stopped. At Wath, near Barnsley, the Great Central built one of the largest marshalling yards in the country. The heaviest trains out of it went over the Worsborough Incline, a climb so severe that the railway built a Garrett articulated locomotive, for a while the largest steam engine in Britain, employed almost entirely to shove coal up one hill. Then dozens a day went down into a 3-mile unventilated tunnel where the crews could not see or breathe. In 1936, the London and North Eastern Railway, under Nigel Gresley, approved a scheme to electrify the whole route at 1500 volts direct current. It was the right answer to the problem. Electric locomotives do not care about smoke in tunnels. They pull hard from a standstill on a gradient, which steam does not. And on the way down the other side, they can be made to give power back, feeding current into the overhead line while holding the train. A prototype was built at Doncaster in 1941, and then had nothing to run on, because the war stopped everything else. Lent to the Netherlands in 1947, it picked up the name Tommy from Dutch railwaymen and carried it for the rest of its life. By the time it came home, the railway had been nationalised, and Woodhead had become a British Railways project. Here, the story turns on a decision that looked reasonable at the time and looks extraordinary in hindsight. The engineers went into the 2 Victorian bores and found them in a bad state. Waterlogged, the brickwork decaying under a century of sulphurous smoke, the profile too tight for overhead wire without major surgery. To rebuild them properly would mean closing the route for years on one of the busiest freight corridors in the north. So they built a 3rd tunnel. It was designed by Sir William Halcrow and Partners, driven between 1949 and 1953, a few yards south of the Victorian pair. 3 miles and 66 yards long, double track, 25 feet from rail to crown, lined throughout in reinforced concrete at least 21 inches thick. In an era of ration books and dollar shortages, and a treasury counting every pound, the country drove a brand new mainline tunnel under the Pennines. It cost £4.25 million, roughly £1.75 million more than the original estimate. 6 men were killed building it. The wires went live in stages. The section from Dunford Bridge east to the Wath Yards was energised in February 1952, and the coal trains that had needed a garret to get them over Worsborough started running behind electric locomotives instead. Electric working through the new Woodhead tunnel began at the end of May 1954, and on the 3rd of June, the Minister of Transport, Alan Lennox Boyd, came up to the moor to open it formally. There are photographs from that day of men in overcoats and hats standing at the portal in what looks like typical Woodhead weather, and of a ribbon across a tunnel mouth in the middle of nowhere. The locomotives were built at Gorton in East Manchester. 58 freight machines descended from Tommy, and 7 much larger express engines, named out of Greek mythology, Electra and Ariadne and Aurora and the rest. For a few years in the middle of the 1950s, the Woodhead route was the most modern main line in Britain. The tunnel that had choked and blinded men for 109 years became the quietest part of the trip. Coal trains that had crawled up the bank behind 2 straining engines now went up steadily behind 1 electric locomotive and came down the other side with the brakes barely touched, pushing power back into the wire for the next train coming up. The express timings between Manchester and Sheffield came down to something a shade over the hour, and the trains ran through the worst weather the Pennines could produce, because ice and smoke and wind mean very much less to an electric locomotive than to a steam one. You could stand at Dunford Bridge, a hamlet on the Yorkshire side with a pub and a handful of houses, and watch 100+ trains a day come out of a hole in the hill under wire, in a place where, in living memory, people had watched men carried out unconscious. That was the achievement. It lasted about 15 years in its full form. The first crack was a decision made a long way from Woodhead. In 1956, 2 years after Lennox Boyd cut the ribbon, the British Transport Commission settled on 25 kilovolts alternating current as the national standard for mainline electrification. That was the correct engineering call. Alternating current at high voltage needs fewer substations, lighter overhead equipment and less copper. And the whole of the West Coast Main Line and everything after it was built to that standard. What it did to Woodhead was to strand it. Every mile of 1500-volt wire in the country was now an orphan, compatible with nothing, with a locomotive fleet that could work nowhere else, and a spares supply that would have to be maintained for one route alone. The line was still doing its job. It had been left behind by a standard adopted after it was already finished. The Greek-named expresses went first, withdrawn in 1968 after 14 years with plenty of life left in them, and sold to the Dutch railways, whose network still ran at 1500 volts. Machines built for the Pennines finished their careers on the flat land between Amsterdam and Maastricht. Passenger services went next. Beeching had put duplicate Trans-Pennine routes on the table, and Sheffield had 2 ways west, Woodhead and the Hope Valley line through Edale and Chinley. Woodhead was faster, newer and electrified, but Hope Valley ran through villages where people actually lived, and Woodhead's intermediate stations were places like Crowden and Dunford Bridge. moorland halts serving a few dozen households and a reservoir keeper. The review took the route with the passengers on it. The Manchester to Sheffield trains through Woodhead ran for the last time on the 5th of January 1970. The same day, Sheffield Victoria closed after 118 years. East of Hadfield, under the wires, there was now nothing but freight. That freight was coal, and by the end of the 70s, almost all of it was one flow. South Yorkshire coal going west to Fiddler's Ferry power station on the Mersey. When British Rail announced in 1980 that the route would close completely, that flow was the argument. And the argument was had properly in the House of Commons on the 11th of March 1980. The member who raised it was Alan Mackay, MP for Pennines, whose constituency the line ran through, and who had worked in the pits before he was elected. Converting Woodhead to the national standard would cost about £24 million, he said, against something like 200 million to build a new Trans-Pennine railway from nothing, if one were ever wanted again. The route was losing around £1.3 million a year, set against British Rail freight revenues in the hundreds of millions. The track had recently been relaid. The signalling was sound. The tunnel could take the taller container traffic that everyone knew was coming. About 260 jobs were at stake in an area where unemployment was rising fast. And no motorway was planned or likely between Manchester and Sheffield. So whatever moved between those two cities would have to move on the roads that already existed. The reply came from Kenneth Clarke, then 39 and a junior minister at the Department of Transport. He was not evasive, and he did not pretend the decision was his. Closing a freight-only line, he explained, was a commercial matter for the British Railways Board, and ministers had no power to stop one. That is the mechanism that matters here. Passenger closures required a public process, notices in local papers, objections heard by a consultative committee, a decision by the Secretary of State. Freight closures required none of that. Woodhead's passengers had gone in 1970, and with them had gone every legal handle anybody had on the route's future. Read those two speeches now, and the striking thing is that nobody was lying. Clarke's figures were real. The coal traffic was going, and it was going for reasons that had nothing to do with railway policy. Mackay's figures were real too. The difference between them was time. Clarke was answering the question of what the line was carrying that year. Mackay was answering the question of what it would cost to get it back, if anyone ever wanted it again. Only one of those questions had a departmental process attached to it. The last months were undramatic. Traffic thinned, crews were redeployed, and photographers came up to Woodhead and Torside through the spring of 1981 to take pictures of a working railway that everyone knew was finished. Nothing sags in them. The wires are tight, the ballast is clean, the concrete in the tunnel mouth is barely stained. Just before 5 in the morning, on Saturday the 18th of July 1981, a Speedlink freight off the Harwich line came west through the Woodhead tunnel and out into Longdendale. It was still dark on the Yorkshire side. There was no ceremony, no last train headboard on the front, no crowd on a platform, because there were no platforms left to stand on. A handful of people were out on the moor to see it. Somewhere around Hadfield, the train ran onto the section that was staying open. And that was the end of 136 years of railway under Woodhead. 34 of the freight locomotives were withdrawn. Their 1500-volt wires ran nowhere else, and the Dutch had bought all they needed a decade earlier, so the fleet had no second life to go to. One was taken into the National Collection, the rest went for scrap. What happened to the ground afterwards decides whether any of this was reversible, and the answer came quickly. The track between Hadfield and Pennines was lifted in the mid-1980s, and in 1984, the surviving Glossop and Hadfield commuter service was converted to the national standard, ending the direct current system in Britain outside the Third Rail South. The track bed up the Longdendale Valley became a footpath, the Longdendale Trail, and later a link in the Trans-Pennine Trail. If you walk that path today, from Hadfield toward Woodhead, on a clear afternoon with the reservoirs on your right, you are walking on the formation of an electrified main line, and the giveaway is the gradient. Footpaths do not stay that consistently flat for 12 miles. Cuttings and embankments survive, bridge abutments survive, and here and there, a concrete base where a catenary mast stood. At the top, the 3 portals are still there in the hillside, fenced off. The 2 Victorian bores had carried a 400 kilovolt national grid cable route across the Pennines since 1963, which was the one useful thing left for them to do. Between 2008 and 2012, over the objections of a long-running campaign to keep the alignment available, the grid moved that cable route out of the old tunnels and into the 1953 one, on the grounds that the newer bore was safer and easier to maintain. In November 2013, the decision was taken to seal the Victorian tunnels. The best tunnel under the Pennines is now a cable duct, and it is not coming back. The towns paid in the ordinary way, which is to say slowly and without anyone recording it as a cost. Penistone kept a railway, though a thinner one. The freight line down the Don Valley to the steelworks was mothballed in 2024. Dunford Bridge went from a place where 100 trains a day emerged from a mountain to a place where people park to walk the trail. Sheffield Victoria's site has fragments left, a wall, a stretch of platform, and a campaign to reopen it that has never quite died. So was it worth it? The honest answer has 2 halves, and the second half is the one that stings. The first half is that the decision was defensible on its own terms. The coal was going, and within a few years, the industry that generated the traffic was being dismantled outright. Nobody at British Rail was wrong about tonnage. Keeping a fully electrified mainline staffed on non-standard equipment, with a renewal bill coming, would have cost real money that had to come from somewhere else. The second half is that the cost of being wrong was wildly asymmetric, and nobody in the process was asked to weigh it. If the line had been mothballed and the alignment kept, the cost would have been fencing, drainage, and the patience to leave a strip of ground alone. Instead, the rails came up, the wires came down, houses and roads went across the formation in places, and the tunnel that would have been the expensive part of any revival got filled with somebody else's cables. A decision that could have been temporary was made permanent by default, because there was no procedure for anything else. Meanwhile, the traffic between Manchester and Sheffield did not vanish. It went onto the A628 over Woodhead, which is still a single carriageway trunk road over a 1,000-foot pass, still notorious for lorries and winter closures, and still the main road link between 2 cities of that size. No motorway was ever built. Transpennine rail passengers go the long way round through the Hope Valley on a line running near capacity, sharing it with stone trains at a journey time that a Class 77 would have beaten in 1958. Every few years somebody produces a report with a map on which the Woodhead alignment appears in a dotted line. Walk up to the portals at Woodhead in bad weather, which is most weather, and there is very little to tell you what happened here. Water comes off Bleaklow. The wind moves across the fenced-off mouths of 3 tunnels, driven a century apart by men who mostly did not sign their work. Somewhere under the grass behind you is the formation of an electric main line, and somewhere behind the fence is 136 years of coal, smoke, cholera, ambition and arithmetic, sealed up and carrying cables. Every line in this series has people who remember it, and the comments on these videos are usually better history than anything I can find in a book. So tell me yours. Which line did you lose? Which station did you last see open? And what stands on the ground now?